One, I thought tonight I would focus, since I'm in a book promotion mode, focus on summarizing and then opening up for discussion my latest book. So a couple of things I wanted, well, more than a few things I wanted to say about it, but I do want to restrict it to at most 20, 25 minutes. I often think when I hear people presenting new material or books being interviewed, the first thing I want to hear is, why should I care? Why is it relevant? Or why is it pertinent? And then I want to hear, why is it distinctive? I mean, maybe many books have been written on this before. So what's new about it? Why, if it is distinctive, why it is? And then, I don't know, maybe certain bells and whistles about anything provocative in it, anything that kind of catches attention. So I think on those, and I have 8 or 9 exhibits I just want to show you after I say this or as I go. I think what the relevant and pertinent part, I think, is easy because capitalism's under attack. Now, how much it's under attack, historically speaking, I don't know. I think I would classify it as bad as the 30s and maybe the 70s. So in the 1930s, it was tremendously under attack, and it was scapegoated for the Great Depression and other things. And fascism and communism were on the rise in that decade, if you remember and know your history. Now, the 70s were pretty bad as well, with all the turmoil and all the terrible economic performance, but also largely blamed on capitalism and the greed of oil companies. Remember all that stuff. So I think, and what I argue in the book is there's an animosity. I would date basically the last 2 decades, a return of great animosity toward capitalism and this kind of delusional belief that alternative systems might be preferable, including things like democratic socialism. So I don't think it's difficult to argue that a book on capitalism, especially one that defends it, is very pertinent and very relevant, and also odd in the sense that it's not that a lot of books on capitalism aren't being written. I do keep track of these, and there's one coming out every week. I mean, I think the publishers have realized if capitalism or capitalist is in the book title, it sells. But as I scan these books and peruse them, 98% of them are anti-capitalist. So that alone, I think, is an interesting kind of mystery. So that's one thing. I think also distinctiveness. I want to say something about the distinctiveness. Besides the fact that this is an avowedly pro-capitalist book, there are some other pro-capitalist books, historically. I think what's really distinctive about this one is it recognizes capitalism as more than economics. It's very common among even free market economists. They call themselves free market economists, that their focus mainly is on economics. And they're, in many ways, I think, perplexed as to why there'd be such animosity toward capitalism, because it produces the goods. I mean, even its critics say that. Marx said it as far ago as the Communist Manifesto. So it's a head scratcher for most free market economists that on the one hand, they think, wow, maybe people are against capitalism, because they don't know how supply demand works, or they don't know price theory, or they don't know what free trade, is mutually advantageous. And all the economic arguments in the world are not going to change people's view of capitalism if they characterize it as evil, if they characterize it as unjust, if they're discussing it on a moral level. So if that's the case, which I think is the case, they're going to say, who cares whether it's practical or not? It's immoral. And now you have to have a theory that says, people are largely motivated by ethics more than by economics, and possibly even more than by politics. What's distinctive about this book in terms of my take is, again, expanding it beyond just the economics of it. I take what's called a PP&E approach. And in academia, PP&E is a more interdisciplinary approach. And the PPE stands for philosophy, politics, and economics. So it's uniquely capable of handling capitalism and all its rivals, precisely because these systems have those elements to them. It's not just an economic system, not just a political system, it's not just a philosophic system. So the book's structure, and I'll go through the table of contents quickly after this, you'll see, has almost equal weights of discussion on the philosophy of capitalism, meaning really the morals of it, the ethics of it, the justice of it. and the critiques of that, of course. And also there's politics in there, and also there's economics. So for the pure economist reading this, it will be new to them to hear the political, ethical arguments. For the pure philosophers who are not comfortable with politics and economics, they'll get the politics and economics of capitalism. There are poli-sci majors out there who, very few of them are going to be pro-capitalist, but if they get a little economics and philosophy out of this, they would be benefited as well. So I think of it as like, the standard 3 legs of a stool. If it's just one leg, it's not going to stand. If it's 2, it's not going to stand. These 3 legs are not only the 3, philosophy, politics, and economics, are not only going to enable people to understand capitalism better, but I would say for the advocates of capitalism, a much better foundation for defending capitalism. And I would actually put it to the critics that if you really want to be a critic of capitalism, you have to attack it on these 3 levels as well. It can't be attacked just on one level, we know, on economics. It's not vulnerable on that score, and the enemies know that. So in many ways, the enemies of capitalism are agreeing with my approach of having this 3-pronged approach. Now, I do teach PP&E at Duke, so some of this, I think this book, I was pro-capitalist before I started teaching at Duke, but I would say that teaching at Duke in the PP&E program has enormously increased my understanding of capitalism. And there's a particular, I would say also there's a particular seminar that I put together for freshmen, a very small seminar. Seminars mean no more than 20 students. And I've done this now 4 years in a row, and it's just very illuminating to give. It's called Capitalism For and Against. So it's a seminar where half the readings are defending capitalism from these 3 perspectives, and the other half of the readings are trashing capitalism from these 3 perspectives. So the students get that. Me teaching it repeatedly has enormously increased my understanding of this whole thing. So that's one point. Another point is, and I think now actually it's worth going through some of the slides. So that's just a summary slide at the top. If you go to the next one, Abby, this is actually right in the preface. I say right up front, this interrogative, where have all the capitalists gone? I use a play on words a little bit. If you ask a person what a socialist is, they'll say an advocate of socialism. But if you ask them what a capitalist is, they'll say, I don't know, a financier, a venture capitalist. They very rarely will say an advocate of capitalism. But that's how I'm using the word. I'm using the word as where have all the capitalists gone, not in the sense of where did all the bankers go, where did all the financiers go, but where did all the advocates of capitalism go? And I do recount in the book who they were, how they enabled the US and others to win the Cold War, and how capitalism was actually advancing in the last 2 decades of the last century, namely 1980 to 2000, but it's been in retreat since. So that is really what it's examining. It's examining in a way, why, even though it has this wonderful economic record, it's in retreat, and what it would take to bring them back, actually. So now this particular passage is a summary. This is from the preface, and it says, I have my glasses here. My argument can be stated succinctly. Capitalism is the only legitimate habitat for humanity. Now get this now, I say it's sustainable because it's practical. It's practical because it's moral. It's moral because it's egoistic. And it's egoistic because it's rational, and humans are natural, I go on to say. Now, when you think of this link and this sequence, that's a long sequence of argument, but notice it includes philosophy, politics, the practical issues, as well as the moral issues. And I'm arguing here that no argument for capitalism can forget all these things. So go up a little more, Abby, and I'm going to elaborate on these, but first show you the structure of the book. These are a series of essays I wrote over the last decade. Half of them are over the last 5 years, so they're fairly new and fairly fresh. And they come from 4 or 5 different sources. Some were written at Forbes. Some were written at the American Institute for Economic Research. Some were written new for this book. The preface is certainly new for the book. Some of them were from my investment consulting firm and are only available to clients until now. But what I did is I went through, and there were clear themes. I haven't changed my views that much. I've just learned more over the last decade. So I thought I would start more philosophical. This first section is about the meaning of capitalism and the moral arguments pro and con on capitalism. This, and you see there's, a half a dozen essays or more under that section. So it's structured logically, in a sense, not chronologically. In each case, the chapters and the essays, you get the original sources as to where they came from. Now, the second section has more to do with freedom and governance. So that would be classified, I think, as more politics than anything. So the first section is about ethics and morals. The second one's really about government and its role in a capitalist system. The next one is really about economics. So section 3, called the primacy of production, if you look there, the essays and the entries are mostly about economics, but they start with the basics like Say's law. There's stuff in there about Keynes versus Say's law. In all cases, I'm giving the pros and cons as well and refuting them as well. Now, if you go to the next section, Abby, 4, money and banking. Now, this is obviously economics, but it's one of my specialties. I was in the banking industry for the 80s and 90s. And so I'm very interested in, and I think it's highly topical, the way money and banking and central banking generally are going these days. They're really going off the rails. So the whole issue of money, sound money, the gold standard versus not, modern monetary theory, that's all in this section, including the Federal Reserve becoming really a reckless, ruleless set of rulers. The business cycle, obviously also economics. My forecasting firm does a lot with the business cycle, so I thought I would include some essays in there. Those are going to be more quantitative. Those are going to be more tips on how to forecast the business cycle, but also an argument that it's not markets left free that cause boom and bust, but rather governments that do. Now, the next one, if you notice, is a mix of economics and, I would say, politics, the fiscal state and its burden. Here, you're going to get a lot of essays on taxes, and not just the economic effect of taxes, but the politics of it, the populism of it, the soak the rich type of stuff. What did we just have this past week? An argument about whether there should be a billionaire's tax. So I talk about the fairness or not of the tax code, whether a graduated income tax is unfair or not. I say it's unfair. I detail in here the burden on the producers and the wealthy, the unnecessary burden, and also basically the fiscal state out of control. We have a burgeoning welfare state where the funders of it do not want to tax people because they'll get thrown out of office. So one theme in this section is that there's a bias toward deficit spending. There's a bias toward chronically spending more than is taken in taxes. And of course, you have to borrow the difference. So the burgeoning debt, the Fed's desire to monetize that debt is all part of a piece in this particular section. Now, the next section is clearly back to morality, if you will. Justice and inequality, questions about whether capitalism is just or not, whether it's just for people to be rich or not, whether inequality is okay or not. I argue here that capitalism is essentially a system of unequal performance and unequal rewards. However, that's not a bad thing. The problem today is that there's a unwillingness to have equality before the law. There's a real erosion, I argue in this section, of constitutionally limited government and a throwing out of the idea that people should be treated equally before the law. My contention here is that people are unequal. They're not only unequal in their birth status, but they're unequal in the kind of professions they choose, in the work ethic they have. And so we think my view is it should be natural that people end up in different positions economically, but it doesn't mean they got there by robbing others. And we shouldn't be envious toward those who are more successful. Unfortunately, the welfare state and the entire tax code these days is geared exactly to codifying envy. All right, now the next section, I hope you see, by the way, by these sections that as you go through them, you're going to get a mix of philosophic, political, and economic arguments. Globalization and trade is obviously a hot topic. I don't have as many essays here because actually it was not a contended thing until Trump came along. So many of these are obviously defenses of free trade, critiques of protectionism, a defense of globalization, which just means global trade. There's a critique coming from both conservatives and nationalists and socialists against free trade. So I thought that was worth discussing. I come out with actually a very rare argument for unilateral free trade, which is the idea that you do not sit down and strike free trade agreements with other countries. You don't basically waste your time doing that. You just adopt free trade on your own, regardless of what others do. Now, this next one on crisis, the whole idea of things in crisis, is it caused by free markets or not? Does government fix those crises or cause them? That's what I examine here. And the three biggies, of course, in the last 2 decades are 9/11 and its aftermath, the financial crisis of 08, 09, and then more recently, this COVID stuff. Now, that my theme here is, in many cases, these crises are, one, caused by a government, and then two, used as a pretext for more government controls and government takings of liberty. So a hot topic now, many essays in here on that issue. And I think the whole history of crises and emergency powers and decrees and things like that it's manifest that those are causing capitalism to be submerged. These are not crises caused by capitalism, but it's certainly the claim of the anti-capitalist that every time there's a crisis, somehow capitalism caused it. The next one, varieties of anti-capitalism. Here, I draw from work I've done at Duke about what I call the friends and foes of capitalism. And there are many foes. There are many enemies. And the essays basically deal with that. Why do they oppose capitalism? What are the reasons they give for opposing capitalism? So this is a section that basically highlights the idea of, even for a pro-capitalist, you're going to face a gauntlet of opposition, and you need to know where it's coming from. But actually, I have to say the whole theme of the book really is you can't be defensive about it. Remember, Donald Trump in his State of the Union said something like, the United States will never become a socialist country. And when I first heard that, I thought, oh, well, that's a sentiment I share. But notice how defensive it was. We will not become socialists. Now, what is he reacting to? The Squad and these others who are pushing socialism. What would it take for a president to say, I want America to become a more capitalist country? See, that's a more taking the offense and saying there's a case to be made for capitalism, not this defensiveness to be against anti-capitalism. If you advance it, Abby, I'm just going to go through a couple of exhibits that I've excerpted. There are, last time I counted, I think there's more than 60 exhibits. And so you'll get from this book some nice pictures and graphs that illustrate interesting relationships. So it's not just reading prose for 500 pages. It is a long book. It's 500 pages, but it's chock full of really good stuff. I thought I would just highlight some of these exhibits. They're actually a little more philosophical, so they're not going to be, line charts of interest rates and things like that, although they're in there. But I'm going to highlight the ones that are more about capitalism. Now, here's an example of an exhibit taken very early on in the book. I think it says page 34 there. Now, if you look on the left and then on the right, I'm basically saying these are the pillars of the two systems. And notice at the very bottom, if you start with capitalism, it says reason, then going up from there, it says egoism, then going up further, individualism, private ownership, rights, and constitutionalism. So the bottom issues are like philosophical. What's the role of reason and the mind in the system? And then the ethic of, are you pursuing self-interest or something else? Is it an individualist type system or not? And to me, that all leads to, well, that's why there would be private ownership. Private ownership is a very individualist thing. The whole idea of rights to life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness, a very American, a very capitalistic thing. Constitutionalism, the idea that government can't do just whatever it wants, but must be restricted by a constitution. Now, on every score in this essay, this is just an exhibit from an essay, statism has the opposite focus. It's not based on reason, but on feelings and subjectivity. It's not calling for individualism and egoism, but rather sacrifice yourself for the collective, sacrifice for yourself for the group. Don't think of yourself, think of the general interest instead. And of course, public ownership or control of the means of production, even the leftists and some of the fascists will say, yes, that's exactly what we demand. And you're duty bound to do that. And the government's going to be authoritarian, not constitutionally limited. So this is the kind of knowledge I'm trying to give the reader so they get a better sense of capitalism versus its opposites. Now, statism is a broader term. It's the idea that the state is all important, and there can be types of statism. So let's go to the next level, and I'll show you that. This matrix I use at Duke and elsewhere has been very helpful. What is statism? It's well recognized by all parts of the spectrum. If you ask a socialist, what is socialism? And the terminology is very confused today, so I think this is illuminating. The socialist will say, my system is public ownership of the means of production. What does that mean? It means the government owns factories, equipment, tools, resources, things like that. And there's also this issue of control, if you think about it. You might own something in title, but if others get to tell you what to do with that thing, if they control the means by which you use it, you don't really have full control of your property. So what I've done here with this matrix is I've said, let's look at ownership and control together. And capitalism, and again, the enemies of capitalism would pretty much admit this. Capitalism is a system where the means of production are both owned and controlled privately. Again, it's not like there's no government, but the government is not telling you what to do with your property. You own your property and you decide what to do with it. Now, in the footnote below, I say, let's go beyond just talking about the means of production. Let's also talk about the products of production. So it's not just factories and equipment and things like that, but personal effects, your car, your laptop, your toothbrush. Those things are going to be privately owned and privately controlled under capitalism. Now, the complete opposite, if you go to the other diagonal in the southeast quadrant, if you will, socialism is not only public ownership, but public control of the means of production. And again, the socialists will admit that. Now, fascism, I think, is actually the direction that the West is going. This is a controversial term. Everyone thinks of Hitler and Mussolini when they hear of fascism, as they should. But notice where I put fascism. It's private ownership, right? It's in that quadrant, but public control. So the fascists, if you look at the fascist history, and they'll admit this, they never nationalized anything. That they didn't take over industries and factories and companies. They let them remain free, but they told them what to do. They micromanaged everything they did. It was a heavy regulatory state. And their feeling, of course, was if we own the thing, they'll run it into the ground like the socialists do. So we don't want to do that. But on the other hand, we want to use it for statist purposes. So one feature of fascism is not only that, the heavy regulatory control of private industry, but also they do promote big business. So this isn't very confusing to people because it sounds capitalist. The reason they promote big business under fascism is it's easier to control fewer businesses than to control a plethora of smaller businesses. So that the whole, what they call the corporatist model, the corporatist state, the quote partnership between government and business, which is very common in fascism, should not be seen as a version of capitalism. It's a version of statism. So that's something to look for when you see someone like Obama or Bernie Sanders. They'll say, I'm not a socialist because I'm not trying to nationalize everything. Yeah, but if you look at all the things they're trying to regulate, they're actually more accurately characterized as fascist. And that's a terrible system. I won't talk about feudalism right now because that's not as relevant, but that's in the fourth category. Okay, so move up, Abby, to the next. Here's another exhibit that really goes to the title of the book. When I said, where have all the capitalists gone? And I said, we need to think of capitalists as advocates of. This exhibit might be difficult to see, but it takes up a full page in the book. Here I recount a very interesting 40, 50-year period. That's all it was. It was an amazing 40 or 50-year period, basically starting at the end of World War II and ending with the end of the Soviet Union. And what I've given you here is basically the most influential capitalists in the sense of advocates of capitalism. And if you look, they range from economists to political theorists to philosophers to novelists. And the big names, of course, you might not know the early names like Snyder, but Snyder was very good. Capitalism, the Creator, he wrote, 1940, fabulous book. Hayek is in here, The Road to Serfdom. Mises is in here, Human Action. These names will be familiar to some of you, but this is just a library of pro-capitalist arguments that any pro-capitalist really should master. Hazlitt's in here, Economics in One Lesson. Ayn Rand is in here, The Fountainhead, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. Schumpeter's in here, great champion of the entrepreneur, capitalism, and profit seeking. Notice Mises, The Anti-Capitalist Mentality. Hazlitt's critiques of Keynes, which were fabulous. Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal came in the 60s. Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Nozick was really important because he was a Harvard professor. It was unknown in Harvard and elsewhere that there would be anyone who would stand up for the free society, and Nozick did, and that was huge. Now, fast supply side movement as well, as I tip my hat to here. Now, what is it leading to? It led to people like Thatcher, Reagan, Mulroney in Canada, winning election in the 80s and changing policy away from Keynesian interventionism towards supply side pro-entrepreneur capitalists, not pure capitalism, but in that direction, moving in that direction. And the famous fall of the Soviet Union, I mean, absolutely unpredicted by anybody, including some on the right. Some on the right even thought that they were monolithic. And but it's just a great period and shows how improved the world can get when people are pro-capitalist. Now, the real mystery that I addressed in the book is, where are all these capitalists? The one simple answer would be they're in their graves. They're all gone. But why didn't they produce students? Well, I'm a student in a way. I'm a student. Many of us are students of these great thinkers. But we really, I use we, the royal we, a little loosely here. We really have not carried the torch or taken the baton from these and advanced the argument. And that's a mystery, and that's something that's worth discussing and analyzing, because otherwise we're going to lose this system and lose this great country. But my bottom line answer, not to give away the plot, I'll give away the plot a little bit, it's that the moral argument has to be emphasized. The morals of capitalism, the rational egoism of capitalism has to be more forthrightly defended. The individualism of it, those pillars I was talking about before, that is really what's making people cringe. That's really what's making people reticent. They're really reluctant to go there. And as a result, they're being steamrolled by the moral certainty of these others who are claiming to have the moral high ground. They don't have the moral high ground, but the advocates of capitalism sadly say don't quite know that yet. One more, Abby. I think there's one more, or that might be the end of it. Let me check. Is that okay? Let me skip over that one. That's a little too detailed. Now, this one's a little too detailed, so I'm not going to go through all of it, but this is the last exhibit in the book, and it's taken from my seminar, and this is the kind of condensation that you'll really enjoy from the book. What this is the friends and foes of capitalism, organized by the three big questions. And we take an entire semester to go through this with the students. But by the end of it, they're able to fill in these little thumbnail sketches. But notice up top what I'm asking of each set of ideas. What do they define capitalism to be? Do they think it's moral? Do they think it's practical? Do they think it's sustainable? And notice what I have. I have the Marxists, then I have Keynesians, then I have conservatives, libertarians, objectivists, environmentalists, feminists. We go through their writings, we go through their arguments, and it's really fascinating to see it quite this way, because they all have very definitive views on these three questions. And I think it's an enormously valuable way to summarize, who the friends and foes are. And you can see from this that even the friends might have very weak arguments. As just one example, Schumpeter, I said, is very good. Schumpeter's great about capitalism is wonderful. Capitalism is dynamic. It's the entrepreneurial system. We should have liberalism in the good sense of liberty. We should have limited government. But guess what Schumpeter's actual view on capitalism's sustainability was? He said it wasn't sustainable. Why? Because the intellectuals will come to hate it. So it's a different view than the Marxist view. The Marxist view was capitalism will burst apart. It'll so exploit labor that labor will rise up and overthrow capitalism. Well, that hasn't happened, but obviously Marx is not in the camp of people saying capitalism is sustainable. But some of capitalism's friends don't even think it's sustainable. And that's not a very good argument. If capitalism isn't sustainable, what's the point of defending it on any grounds, moral, practical, or economic? I know some libertarian friends, by the way, who will say something like this. Capitalism is great, but here's what happens. The wealthier capitalists get, they just can't stop themselves from bribing politicians. So what is the big word in Austrian economics and public choice economics? Rent seeking. What's rent seeking? Corporations bribing politicians for special favors. So see, these libertarians think that's inevitable. They think it's unavoidable. And they'll say crony capitalism comes out of free market capitalism. See, that's not my view. That's not really Ayn Rand's view. Our view is if you get a mixed economy, if you throw away constitutional limits on government, if you allow politics to bleed into economics, you're going to get corruption. You're going to get the kind of bribery and extortion we see. But it's just as much extortion on the part of politicians extorting things from the private sector as it is the private sector seeking favors. So the solution to something like that, to make capitalism truly sustainable, you have to fight for constitutionally limited government. That's what's going to stop the corruption. That's going to stop the issue of the money affecting politics. I have an essay in here right to this point. It goes something like this. The title was, "To Get Money Out of Politics, Get Politics Out of Money Making." You see the idea? That you only have money in politics because politics is so involved in money making, redistributing that wealth, making people want to care about who's in office versus not. So I think I'll stop there. That's a basic summary of the entire theme of the book, really, more than anything, and I'd be glad to take comments or questions from here.